Hello, Brovs. We're back with the conclusion of Chapter 2 of Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, by Major General Frank Richardson, MD, PhD, etc., etc. The word slender in this report conflicts with all contemporary evidence, and as Henry himself said in his memoirs that the body was found enormously fat, it is obvious that he used the term to reinforce his description of the body as effeminate, to several observers. A feminine quality was perceptible in Napoleon's magnetic power to woo the affections of those whom he wished to enslave. But even more noticeable to his contemporaries was a gradually increasing female configuration of his body. Many references to this are to be found in the literature, some of which seem to stem from similar sources, such as remarks made by D. Segur, Las Casas, and Antimarchi. But some independent observers have supplied corroborative details. We read of a roundness, but not belonging to our sex, and there are many descriptions of his hands, such as this one by Captain Maitland, of Bellerophon. His hands were also very small, and had the plumpness of a woman's rather than the robustness of a man's. The Duchess of Abrantes called them beautiful little pink hands, and Napoleon's secretary, de Meneval, said that they were delicate and plump with taper fingers. Napoleon was very proud of his plump and shapely hands, and also, according to de Meneval, he loved to joke about the fatness of his breasts. In fact, it is to Napoleon himself that we owe the most complete picture of his own appearance in his later life, in a remark which he made to Automarchi, of which there are different translations on the following lines. "See, doctor, what lovely arms, what smooth white skin without a single hair, breasts plump and rounded. Any beauty would be proud of a bosom like mine. And my hand, how many amongst the fair sex would be jealous of it?" Next, he's going to come out as the first ancient trans. Considering Napoleon's dislike and contempt for Antimarchi, who was to him the wrong sort of Corsican, this sounds to me like a pathetic appeal for at least one doctor to understand this most intimate problem. When Napoleon saw in his own figure, as many writers who knew him personally have confirmed that he did, a resemblance to a young female beauty, he flattered himself. A well-known story related how, as he sat beside his new empress, Marie Louise, in his coach, dressed in the over-ornate robes which he had himself designed for state occasions, he was mistaken for her elderly governess by a bystander, who is variously described as a provincial footman, an elderly peasant, or a young country boy. The portrait of Napoleon painted at St. Cloud in March 1812 makes it abundantly clear how easy it must have been to make such a mistake. Looking at that portrait, which is reproduced opposite page 65, let's go look at this. That's the one at St. Cloud. He looks like a woman. Looks like a grizzled old prick to me. Well, this guy looks more like a woman than he does, quite frankly. There he looks very manly. There he just looks like Fat Elvis. Let's be honest about that, buddy. Looking at that portrait, which is reproduced opposite page 65 of this book, and in imagination placing the absurd feathered bonnet above the pale, puffed, womanish face, the mistake does not seem surprising. The conquering general fades into the comfortable old governess, with little strain on our credulity. I find it impossible to believe that this domineering ruler of men, to whom virility must have meant a lot, really did love to joke about the fatness of his breasts, or that his feminine shape was anything but a cruel personal tragedy, about which he tried to show a brave face. It must have been at least part of his failure to achieve perfect sexual adjustment. What does that mean? leading to psychological mechanisms which made him the kind of man he was. His womanly appearance and small external genital organs, hypogonadism, could have been the result of various conditions which are recognized today but were unknown to doctors in this day. Well, he slept with seemingly everybody with his small pecker, so I mean, you would think there's all kinds of accounts of his small genitalia out there, but who knows? Doctor, maybe they were just doing it just to see if he was baby endowed. Dr. Leonard Guthrie in 1913 expounded the theory that Napoleon was a case of Froelich syndrome, dystrophia adiposo-genitalis, and Dr. Sokoloff, Lieutenant General Bryce, Mr. Kemble, and other medical experts have agreed with him. This term was applied to cases in which arrested genital development is associated with obesity and some stunning of growth, but it would be unprofitable to discuss in any detail whether this diagnostic label can properly be applied to Napoleon, because modern thought inclines to the view that the cases in which it can be used are very few. And indeed, the term Froelich syndrome is an outmoded one of mainly historical interest. Knowledge of endocrinology has progressed since Froelich defined the syndrome, but although it would be unfashionable to regard it as a specific disease or entity in itself, the findings associated with it continue to be recognizable in cases in which there is some disorder of the pituitary gland, which was always recognized as being the cause of the condition, together with damage to the neighboring area of the brain called the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is an internally secreting gland of the endocrine system and has been called the leader of the endocrine orchestra, an expression which indicates how closely linked are disturbances of these important glands which control many aspects of growth and development. Several medical writers have believed that during the period of Napoleon's greatest ascendancy, there was excessive activity of his pituitary gland, which became exhausted prematurely, burned out in popular parlance, with resultant hypopituitarism under activity of the gland and progressive deficiency of its internal secretion. This could account for the very authenticated change in his physique and personality, which began in about 1805 or 1808. With increasing obesity, lessened vitality, and a tendency to be sleepy. That sounds like blood sugar issues too, buddy. The process, according to Dr. Guthrie, also included mental decadence, sulky, puerile behavior, and culminated in a peevish, boring, prematurely aged man, untidy in his habits, easily tired, and spending much of his time lying on a couch. I mean, there's a lot of environmental factors of the time, like no pure water, and etc., etc. Napoleon himself obviously recognized the onset of this change, and he often said that 40 would be his dangerous age when he expected to become very fat. He said that at 40 a man is too old to make war, an opinion which few generals of today would care to endorse, any more than the sprightly members of the older set at many a hunt ball would like his remark in a older set as many at many. All right, let's start this again. He said that at 40 a man is too old to make war, an opinion which few generals of today would care to endorse, any more than the sprightly members of the older set at many a hunt ball would like his remark in a letter to Josephine dated 9th October 1808, less than 2 months after his 39th birthday. I attended the Weimar ball, the Emperor Alexander dances, but not I. 40 years are 40 years. The change in Napoleon's personality was particularly noticeable to his generals, many of whom commented very forcibly upon it. Marshal Michael Ney, for example, said during the Russian campaign that he wished Napoleon would go back to his court and leave his generals to get on with the fighting. Carnot, the Minister of War, wrote, I no longer know him. He used to be lean, shy, and silent. Now he is fat and garrulous. He is sleepy and his mind wanders. He, the man of rapid decisions, who resented the proffer of advice, now talks instead of acting and asks opinions. Claude Manceron in Which Way to Turn describes Napoleon's swithering indecisions after Waterloo, in striking contrast to the man of action who is the hero of that author's equally brilliant book, Austerlitz. It must have been on account of the physical change in Napoleon that Dr. Corvisart warned him against marrying again, which he did at the age of 40 and 7 months. Corvisart later believed that this second marriage had adversely affected Napoleon's health, but he did not explain his reasons for this view, nor what were his grounds for advising Napoleon not to marry. That the notorious change in Napoleon was associated with loss of mental balance and the abuse of power was the opinion of Adolphe Thiers, a highly esteemed historian whose history of Napoleon ran into 20 large volumes. That is a lot of volumes. Many historians have agreed with him. Dr. Sokolov saw it all as part of what he called the malady of power, or the malady of Caesars, in which abuse of power leads to destruction of the physical balance with endocrine changes and altered personality. Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, he tells us, shared Napoleon's irritability, peculiar paroxysms of fury, convulsions, nervous spasmodic movements, and involuntary twitchings. It would be interesting to hear the views of Hitler's doctor on this syndrome. The pituitary gland stimulates the gonads or sex glands to activity and deficiency of its secretion by affecting the internal secretion of the sex glands, and the adrenal glands is associated with changes in secondary sexual characteristics, which are characteristics which distinguish male from female. Dr. Cabanis has discussed the possibility that Napoleon's effeminate body was a result of a defect of the pituitary gland. The descriptions of Napoleon's body fit very well into the picture of what is called pituitary eunuchoidism. His hands were typical of that condition, and so was his hair, which in many portraits looks very like the fine silky hair often seen in these cases. Mrs. Abel, no period after her name, or is that Mers Abel, who, as Betsy Balcom knew very well indeed in St. Helena, described it thus: his hair was dark brown and as fine and silky as a child's, rather too much so indeed for a man, as its very softness caused it to look thin. Apart from his hands and hair, there is a startling difference between the plump-faced, increasingly obese figure of the portraits from about 1808 and the lean, hawk-faced young general, with spaniel airs of hair down to his shoulders. Captain Basil Hall, the sailor whose meeting with Napoleon is described in Chapter 1, wrote of his pale face like marble without a single wrinkle or trace of a furrow. An eminent physician, Professor Sir Derek Dunlop, in a personal communication says that this is an admirable description of the youthful eunuchoid or Klinefelter patient. Though when eunuchs get to middle age, they are apt to develop little wrinkles in their colorless skin, which give them the appearance of an elderly aunt. Napoleon was 48 when Captain Hall met him, so perhaps he should have had a few wrinkles, but we have already heard that he had been taken for an elderly governess 5 years earlier. The term Klinefelter patient and the fact that some medical writers have referred to Napoleon's external genital organs as infantile leads me to a brief appraisal of Napoleon's bodily appearance in terms of modern knowledge of genetics. Genetic factors are more important than hormones in sex determination, and within the past 20 years or so, advances in the science of genetics have thrown new light on physical types such as the man with whom we are dealing here, the surprisingly diverse paths which sexual adaptation and development can take through the jungle of intersexuality, and the even more devious paths into which psychological adaptations to sex can divert us will be surveyed in Chapter 4. Here in the post-mortem room, the possibility that we are dealing with one of the so-called intersex types, I told you, he's trans, however unlikely it may be, at least deserves a mention. A new era in genetics began in 1949 with the discovery that there is a difference in the nuclei of cells which is characteristic of females, and within 6 years it had been found that differences between the nuclei of the body cells of males and females could be detected in smears of the mucous membrane lining the mouth and even in certain blood cells. The practice of nuclear sexing now became a new weapon in the diagnostician's armamentarium. Big words. Sex is determined by the kind of spermatozoon. Isn't that zoan? Spermatozoon? I thought it was spermatozoan. Described as X bearing or Y bearing, which happens to fertilize the ovum. In general, X chromosomes produce girls and Y chromosomes boys, but during development, things may go wrong and a great variety of intersex types may result, with various abnormalities and combinations of abnormalities of the sexual organs and of the secondary sexual characteristics. One of the most clearly defined of these intersex types is known as Klinefelter syndrome, which was first described in 1942. The normal chromosomal patterns are XY for a male and XX for a female. In Klinefelter syndrome, the pattern is XXY, so that the Y chromosome, which is responsible for the development of the testicles, has to compete with two X chromosomes instead of only one. This condition is not particularly rare and is possibly as common as 1 in every 400 or 500 live male births. Any reader who cares to study this subject in such textbooks of genetics as those named in the medical bibliography at the end of this book will find that the appearance of cases of Klinefelter syndrome resembles Napoleon's body as Dr. Henry. Why is this guy not? I guess it ain't him, it's the typesetter. Dr. Henry and others describe it. You guys are missing a period, and maybe that was what's wrong with Napoleon. He missed his period too. Look at this. This negligence. Put a period after the DR, buddy. Hypogonadism has many causes. Sometimes no cause at all may be discernible. In Napoleon's case, everything points to the probability that he did not suffer from a genetic condition such as Klinefelter syndrome, but from a secondary condition, a pituitary gonadotrophic failure associated with the pituitary changes, which many medical experts have believed were responsible for the changes in him, which began when he was 35 to 39 years old. The evidence which suggests that he was a hypogonadotrophic eunuchoid type of individual would indicate that it is unlikely that he could have procreated children, and this will be discussed in Chapter 10. The faulty functioning of Napoleon's pituitary gland, with associated defects of other hormones, has been invoked by many medical historians, perhaps too enthusiastically, to explain various facets of his character, like slapping the shit out of people for no reason and pulling their nose. The waxing and waning of its secretions have been correlated with fluctuations in his intellectual power and with his success or failure in battle. We must not get carried away too far by such theorizing. The stubborn endurance of the British infantry and Wellington's superb generalship did far more to win the Battle of Waterloo than Napoleon's pituitary or his prolapsed piles did to lose it. The cause of Napoleon's hypogonadism and of the feminine appearance of his body is of purely academic interest, but I think that it will be agreed that this disability must have had a profound effect upon his adaptation of the demands of the sexual instinct. The foregoing examination of his character and of his medical history has furnished ample indications of the need for a psychiatric investigation. It may seem absurd to suggest that a psychiatric diagnosis can be made without examining the patient, but this is just what is often done when a coroner returns a verdict of unsound mind. In the practice of psychiatry, it is essential to let the patient talk about himself, his anxieties and aspirations. Napoleon needed no encouragement to do this. He had an astonishing capacity amounting to narcissism for standing, as it were, outside himself, contemplating his own career with a kind of wondering awe, not unmixed with wholehearted admiration. Most of the valuable information about this supremely self-centered man is to be gleaned from his own writings, his interminable dictations, his conversations, and confessions recorded by relatives, friends, enemies, secretaries, valets, soldiers, and statesmen of France and other nations. The sexual sphere would appear to be the most significant aspect of Napoleon's case, but there are other facets of his character and personality which are very interesting pieces in the jigsaw puzzle. And these I will now try to fit into the picture. That's great.